Hello, welcome to Do Yourself Justice, the legal podcast that helps you understand your rights without the legal jargon. My name's Danny Lawrence, and today's episode is titled How Not to Be Let Down by the CICA. Oh dear, legal jargon straight away. We'll come to that in a minute. We're talking about what happens after you have been the victim of a violent crime and you approach the government and ask for help and they say, sorry, not our problem. To help make sense of it all, we do have someone who's an expert in the field, unlike me, Elizabeth Duncan, who is a lawyer and partner of Slee Blackwell Solicitors and one of the UK's leading experts in abuse and injury claims. Hi, Liz.
Hi.
So let's deal with that first of all. What's the CICA?
The CICA is the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. It's a government scheme, a government pot of money to compensate the victims of violent crimes.
And I said that you were an expert. You have been recommended by the Legal 500. You're the winner of the Devon and Somerset Law Society Legal Hero Award, specialist in abuse, trauma and injury litigation. And you have recovered over £4.4 million for one client. And in a case relevant to the CICA, you recovered £240,000. So it sounds like you have a lot of dealings with the CICA.
Yeah, I've been working at Slee Blackwell for nearly 10 years, and I spend a huge amount of my time working on CICA cases, reviews and appeals. So yeah, I know the scheme well, and I know the ways of the CICA very well also.
And what drew you to this particular area of law, working with victims of trauma and abuse?
Well, a few years ago, there's some personal circumstances led me to have some dealings with victim support and the court witness service. Through that, I was doing some fundraising with victim support, and then around about the same time, I was lucky enough to see the vacancy at Slee Blackwell in this department, and it was perfect opportunity, perfect place for me, and I've never looked back.
Now, I've said on the podcast before that, like a normal person, my only exposure to the world of law and legal affairs is watching TV crime shows, but those tend to focus on the victim or the defendant. We don't really see it through the lawyer's eyes very often, and it's easy to forget that you legal people are people as well.
We are humans.
I'm interested to know what it actually feels like when you have that £4.4 million win. That must be such a good feeling for obviously for your client, but for you too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super rewarding area to work in, but it's not necessarily the sort of big ticket days at the end of a case. It can be the smaller things along the way. So, for example, with the gentleman with that settlement, it was a workplace accident, and he had devastating injuries to his hands. But the day he was able to lift up his baby with the prosthetics that we were able to get funded, I was reduced to tears, as was anyone else that saw that video. And on other days, it's not necessarily the big settlement, but it'll be like, the sexual abuse victim saying, you believed me, you made them believe me. That makes a real difference, and it's incredibly rewarding.
Yes, I suppose the financial aspect is the headline, but for every person who wins a case, it's a psychological victory, isn't it? But you must
Absolutely.
share that.
So many people say it's not about the money, and it kind of isn't. It sort of has to be, because that's the only remedy available in these kind of cases. But it's about much more than the money. It's about recognition. It's about being vindicated. It's about being believed, and it's about being heard.
And how about the tougher moments then? Do you have a standout case which makes you shudder to recall it because you were not successful?
Yeah, the one that really comes to mind was an application to the CICA that we'd been working on for a gentleman for some time, I think maybe 2 or 3 years. We'd been acting for him. Now, he was a survivor of sexual abuse. He had some terrible psychological issues as a result. And over the life of his claim, he committed a pretty minor offence as a result of the psychological issues he had. And that meant, because of the very sort of narrow scope of the scheme, that defeated his application. And it was a real tragedy, because as I said, the psychological issues were a result of the crime he was applying for compensation for in the first place. So that felt an incredibly unjust outcome for that poor gentleman.
Okay, well, let's dig into the CICA a little more. And we've got a scenario to present. It's a fictional story, but it is based on real cases. It's about Aaron, who's 27, but when he was 25, he was the victim of a violent and unprovoked attack outside a nightclub where he was punched in the face by a stranger, suffered a broken cheekbone, and was left with long-term psychological trauma, including anxiety and panic attacks. He reported the incident immediately and cooperated fully with the investigation, but the attacker was identified, though not prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Aaron required facial surgery and a psychiatrist diagnosed him with PTSD. So it sounds like so far so good, Liz.
Absolutely, so far so good. And Aaron made his application to the CICA within 2 years of the assault, which is the usual time limit for a CICA application where the crime happens when the person's an adult.
However, in our scenario, there is a problem because when Aaron was 18, he received a community order for possession of cannabis with intent to supply. And although he's since turned his life around, it was found that that is an unspent conviction. And so, therefore, the CIC application was rejected. There was no discretion applied to reflect the passage of time or the change around of his life, but should this case have been accepted by the CICA, Liz? What do you think?
It's unfortunately a really not unusual scenario where somebody has had difficulties with the police themselves, and especially if someone's had an abusive childhood, for example. It's not unusual that people can have issues with substances or something like that does lead them to cross paths with the police before they get help. But under the CICA scheme, if you've got an unspent conviction, so that's unspent within the meaning of the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, at the time you make your application or at any point throughout the lifetime of your claim, they can refuse the application. So yeah, in Aaron's case here, assuming that conviction and the buffer period, the period in which the offence is unspent, is factually correct, his application will fail.
But there's discretion, is there?
No, there isn't. So under an older version of the scheme, that there was, but under this one, that there is no discretion.
So without the unfortunate circumstances of the previous conviction, if that case had been simpler and without the conviction, what compensation could Aaron have received, or could anyone receive from the CICA?
So the CICA scheme, everything comes from the scheme, which is a relatively long document that sets out the whole scheme. And part of that scheme is what we call the tariff of injuries. And that is literally a list of the injuries that the CICA will compensate for. There's a set amount for each thing. So, for example, a sexual assault over clothing, £1,000, a punctured lung, £1,500. There's all kinds of things. So if Aaron didn't have that unspent conviction, his application had gone through, he would have been able to recover the tariff amount for his injuries. Now, he wouldn't get everything for each injury. So he's got obviously the facial injury and the psychological impact. But they only pay for 3 injuries maximum, and they pay 100% of the standard amount for the highest injury, 30% for the second, and 15% for the third. So it would depend on the sort of length that he suffered the psychiatric injury and the sort of degree of recovery of the facial injury as to precisely where he'd fall into the tariff for those aspects.
What jumps out at me is there's a huge difference between the £1,000 that you just mentioned for one specific injury and £240,000, which was the figure I gave at the start for a CICA case which you previously won. What was in that case? What made that work?
So the huge difference comes from lost earnings. So where somebody has been unable to work as a result of the injury, and the CICA wording is that the person needs to have no or very limited capacity for paid work. So that's the key definition. Where that applies and that inability or very limited capacity for work continues for over 28 weeks, the CICA will pay something towards lost earnings. Now, it's only the rate of statutory sick pay per week. So, it doesn't replace what people actually lose, but it does add about sort of £5,000 per year to somebody's claim. And that's where the really big settlements come from.
And in Aaron's scenario, we've said that the attacker was identified, though not convicted. What if no one has been arrested? Can I still make a claim in that case?
Yes, you absolutely can still make a claim. There's lots of scenarios where the assailant or the perpetrator of the claim is never identified, or they never face justice. For example, they're not fit to stand trial, or they're too young to face justice, or something like that. In those circumstances, you can still apply. The CICA just need to be convinced on balance of probabilities, so more likely than not, that you've been the victim of a crime of violence as they define it in the scheme.
Let's talk a bit more about the timescale then. How soon do you have to apply? How long does the process take? What exceptions are there to those timeframes and so on?
So the usual time limit to make your CICA application is 2 years. Now, it's 2 years from when the crime happened, if you're an adult when it happens. If you were a child when you were the victim of crime and the police were involved when you were still a child, so under 18, the time limit is 2 years from when you turn 18. So you've got until your 20th birthday. If, however, the police were not involved when you were a child, the police were only involved after you turn 18, you've got 2 years from when you report the crime to the police.
Are there any exceptions to that?
Yeah, there are some exceptions to that the scheme does allow for that time limit to be extended in exceptional circumstances. So, for example, where the impact of a crime has been so devastating on someone's life, they're simply not well enough to be able to seek advice, get their application in. The time limit can be extended.
And in the case of Aaron's scenario, we presented the idea that it was not successful because of a previous conviction. Are there any other things that would limit or prevent my potential to receive compensation?
Yeah, there are a lot of pitfalls. So it's always worth sort of reaching out to someone who knows the scheme very well. But the most common pitfalls we see are where the person's not been able to sort of fully cooperate with the police. It could be quite grueling to go through the criminal justice system. And if somebody hasn't sort of felt able to face that, they can find themselves in a situation where the CICA has rejected their application because they haven't fully cooperated with the police. It's a requirement of the scheme that the injured person has not only reported to the police, but has then cooperated. And the phrasing of the scheme is as far as reasonably practicable to bring their assailant to justice. Now, what does that mean? It can mean if anyone other than the police or the CPS is making the decision to not go ahead, that can result in an application being rejected.
And also in Aaron's case, we included the fact that he did have a psychiatrist assessment that he had suffered from PTSD. I'm just thinking in terms of insurance claims where you have to declare previous existing conditions, which basically mean you're not going to be insured for anything. Does this sort of thing happen where claims are rejected because the medical evidence wasn't there to back it up?
Yeah, that's particularly a problem when it comes to psychiatric injuries. It's a requirement of the scheme that injury is confirmed by a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, or a psychiatrist. It's very unusual to see either of those on the NHS, unfortunately. So that can be something that does trip people up.
And I believe there are cases where people approach you having already been in touch with the CICA and they've had an offer, and then you get a whole lot more on their behalf.
Yeah, so that's a major issue I have with CICA is they do seem to lowball victims of crime, and it would be so easy for those people to look at their letter and be like, well, I guess that's it then. But for example, I was approached by a lady who had an offer from the CICA of £22,000. but we were able to increase that to £240,000. I had another case quite recently where the CICA's first offer was just £3,300, and we increased that to over £90,000. That's £90,000. So from a low offer to a life-changing amount of money, it can be the real difference there.
And how about if you've contacted the CICA on my behalf and we're waiting for a reply? Can you chase them for it?
I can, but we may as well be sort of screaming into the void. There is no set timescale for the CICA to respond. It can be anything from a few months to a few years. A recent case I settled, £235,000 for my client, but it took us over 5 years to get there. So they do not move quickly, and they're incredibly frustrating to deal with.
Right, so the 2-year window that you talked about, that is for me to launch the case after the crime, not for the whole thing to be completed. Well, let's bring it back to Aaron, who was the victim of a violent crime. He suffered, he did everything right, and unfortunately, because of the previous circumstances, he was still turned away. I guess I'm learning that there are situations when you would assume, victim of violent crime is bound to receive some compensation. There are cases where that doesn't happen. Do you have any other examples, Liz?
Yeah, so there's sometimes some very strange sort of gaps in the scheme that people fall into. So one that particularly comes to mind is a man who was attacked in a park, and he had his throat cut by someone with a machete. It doesn't get much more violent crime than that, you would think, but he was not eligible for payment under the scheme because his scarring was not disfiguring enough and his psychological injury was not disabling enough. There was also a case of a lady who was shot, and she was shot, just an innocent passerby, but because her scarring was not significant enough for the CICA, again, she got absolutely nothing. And
here's the magic question then, as a member of the public talking to a lawyer: when should I get legal help with a CICA application?
So it's a very good question, and the answer is probably as early as possible. So we've got a helpline where we, give free advice, free initial advice about an application. If you've got, no obvious issues, we'll, give you some guidance as to how to go ahead. But if you've got any kind of issues in terms of you do have a previous conviction, you are outside the usual time limit, you have had issues with being able to continue working, or the future is unclear in terms of your psychiatric health, then I think it's very, very wise to get professional advice from someone who knows the scheme really well, because it's all too easy to get a decision from the CICA that says, you're out of time, and just think, well, that's that then. It might not be, and we succeed a lot on reviews and appeals for cases that have initially been rejected for a reason like that.
Well, it sounds like it certainly is valuable to know as much as you can about the CICA before you apply. I hope that your free advice today, Liz, is helping somebody watching. Where can people go if they want to find out more?
They can get in touch with us. We've got a free helpline, and we're always happy to run through people's options with them and give them some guidance on what they might like to do. We've got a specialist website, which is CICA criminalinjurysolicitors.co.uk. So that's CICA criminalinjurysolicitors.co.uk.
CICA criminalinjurysolicitors.co.uk. That something more catchy was unavailable, was it?
I suppose so.
Well, Elizabeth Duncan, personal injury and abuse lawyer and partner at Slee Blackwell Solicitors, thank you for joining us. And if you've found this helpful, we would always be glad if you would like, subscribe, share the video with others, and help each other to do yourself justice. My name's Danny Lawrence, and we'll see you next time.
Slee Blackwell Solicitors, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and looking after you.